Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. On a warm July afternoon in 1995, Silver Ridge Lake in western Oregon looked like any other summer picture: flat water, pine trees, and a handful of families trying to forget real life for a weekend. Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. The town behind that lake is Maple Ridge, a small timber community where paychecks rise and fall with the mills, and everybody knows who drives which truck. For the Mercer family, Maple Ridge is home, but Silver Ridge Lake is the one place that feels like a break. Every summer, Ryan and Laura Mercer scrape together enough money to rent the same modest cabin near the water. It's not fancy, wood paneling, uneven porch steps, mismatched dishes, but for them it's routine, predictable, and safe. Ryan is 38, a mechanic who spends most days under hoods and under deadlines. He believes in schedules, oil changes every 3,000 miles, brakes checked before winter, and a lake trip every July. Laura is 36, an elementary school secretary who color codes calendars and keeps spare forms in her purse. She worries about their bills, about how quickly the boys are growing, and about things going wrong. She doesn't voice all of it, but the tension shows in her lists, her double-checking doors, her glances at the clock. Their sons, Evan and Jacob, don't see any of that. Evan is 9, loud, curious, the kind of kid who turns fallen branches into swords and stray screws into treasure. Jacob is 7, softer spoken, usually half a step behind his brother, watching first, joining second. When the family unloads the car that Friday night, cooler, sleeping bags, a dented tackle box, the boys head straight for the small shelf where board games and old paperbacks sit, as if they've never been anywhere else. The next morning is exactly what they've come for. Early light on the lake, the sound of someone's outboard motor far off, and the smell of coffee drifting out of the cabin. Ryan checks his watch out of habit, then sets it aside. Laura wipes crumbs off the counter and mentally adds up what this trip has cost them, then, deliberately, she lets it go. According to the cabin rental log, they've been doing this same first weekend of July pattern for years. There is nothing in those records to suggest this visit will be any different. By late morning, they've loaded the car with picnic basics, sandwiches, chips, a faded blue and white blanket, plastic water bottles, and the boys' favorite toys. They drive a short distance down a gravel lane to a clearing by the shore. Other cabins sit back in the trees, their porches half hidden. A couple walking their dog notices the family as they spread the blanket near the tree line. It's an ordinary snapshot: 2 adults, 2 kids, a small grill, nothing out of place. Ryan sets up a portable camp stove near the car, just up the slope from where Laura is unpacking paper plates and napkins. The boys run between the shallow water and the edge of the woods, chasing each other, scooping up rocks, arguing briefly about who gets which stick. Laura calls out reminders: "Stay where I can see you," "shoes on near the trees," the kind of phrases every parent at that lake has used at some point. As the day goes on, the movements of the family can be tracked almost minute by minute. That's something investigators will later reconstruct from witness statements and Ryan's own memory. Around mid-afternoon, neighbors see Evan and Jacob near the shoreline, splashing in the shallows. At roughly the same time, Ryan walks the cooler back up to the car, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, planning to load a few things so they can leave quickly once everyone's done eating. From that higher spot, he can still see the blanket and part of the tree line. On the grass below, Laura starts to clean up. She stacks plates, ties off a small trash bag, and asks the boys to bring their bottles closer. At some point, they drift back toward the water, then toward the trees. There is no shouting, no sign of distress. No one hears a car door slam nearby. No one reports a stranger suddenly appearing. It's just a family wrapping up a picnic on a clear, breezy day. When Ryan closes the trunk and heads back down the slope, less than 10 minutes have passed. That's his estimate later: 5, maybe 7 minutes. Long enough to move the cooler, not long enough, in his mind, for anything catastrophic to happen. But as he reaches the bottom of the hill, something looks wrong. The blanket is there. The grill is there. 2 pairs of small sandals sit side by side in the grass. The boys are not. At first, he assumes it's a game. Kids ducking behind a tree, waiting to jump out. Laura thinks the same. She raises her voice a little, half amused, half firm. Evan, Jacob, time to pack up. The only response is the sound of wind in the pines and the small slap of water on the rocks. A minute passes. Then another. The tone shifts. What happens next is the beginning of the official record. Ryan walks the immediate area, checking behind bushes, along the water's edge, then farther into the trees. Laura circles in the opposite direction, calling their names louder now, scanning for movement or the flash of a t-shirt. There are no footprints anyone can clearly identify as the boys, no broken branches that stand out. The lake itself is calm, its surface revealing nothing. After a short, frantic search on their own, the Mercers make a decision that will be written into every subsequent report. They call for help. The approximate time of that call, logged by dispatch, becomes the anchor point for the investigation that follows. As the sun tilts lower over Silver Ridge Lake, the first patrol car rolls down the gravel lane toward the clearing. By the end of that day, a missing children file will be opened in Maple Ridge. In the chapters ahead, we'll see how that moment at the lakeshore grows into one of the region's most confounding cold cases. For now, it is still just a summer afternoon, a quiet lake, and a single, unanswered question: where did Evan and Jacob Mercer go? If cases like this matter to you, if you believe stories of the missing should never be forgotten, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these families and their unanswered questions in the light. When the first patrol car rolled up to the clearing at Silver Ridge Lake, the sun was still above the tree line. What began as a family's panicked call for help very quickly turned into a full-scale search for two missing boys. Deputies from the Maple Ridge Sheriff's Office secured the picnic site and the narrow gravel lane leading in. They logged what they saw: a blanket, a small camp stove, 2 pairs of children's sandals, plastic bottles tipped on their sides. No overturned benches, no obvious drag marks, no tire tracks beyond the Mercer's car. The scene looked less like a crime and more like a day interrupted. By nightfall, the operation had grown. A mobile command post went up near the boat launch. Maps of the lake and surrounding forest were tacked to plywood boards under floodlights. Volunteers checked in, were assigned fluorescent vests, and sent into the trees in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder. K-9 teams worked from clothing taken from the Mercer cabin, following faint scent trails through the grass, into the woods, and toward the water's edge, before losing them in a confusion of footprints and soft soil. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison arrived from town as the light faded. He had worked missing persons cases before, but 2 children vanishing in such a narrow window of time caught his attention immediately. He started where he always did, with the timeline. When did the family arrive? Who saw them? How long were the boys out of sight? Separate interviews with Ryan and Laura produced consistent answers. Arrived the night before, picnic late the next morning, the boys last clearly seen near the shoreline just before Ryan walked the cooler up to the car. While deputies and volunteers combed the woods, Ellison and a small team swept through the Mercer cabin. Doors and windows were intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no obvious disturbance inside. The boys' clothes and toys were where you might expect them to be for a weekend away, duffel bags half unpacked, a game left open on the small table. Nothing suggested that the family had come here to leave their old lives behind. On the ground, the search was steered by a man who knew the land better than anyone, Ranger Eric Lawson. A veteran of the Park Service, Lawson divided the forest into numbered sectors, marking them off on laminated maps. Most zones were cleared systematically, but one large, dense area on the northern side of the lake was shaded and labeled unsafe terrain, old windfall, unstable ground, not worth risking civilians in, he said. Ellison accepted that call in the moment. There were plenty of other places to search. Day after day, the operation expanded. Boats dragged the shallows, divers checked near the docks, and helicopters traced slow circles over the timber. If the boys had slipped into the lake, investigators expected something: clothing, a shoe, a body, to turn up. Nothing did. Back in town, Ellison's team quietly pulled the Mercers' financial and phone records. There were no large withdrawals, no unexplained purchases, no secret credit cards. At Evan and Jacob's school, staff confirmed the boys were well-liked, present, and engaged. There were no prior reports of abuse at home, no custody battles, no threats. The usual red flags simply weren't there. The media arrived quickly. Local news vans parked along the road into the park, lenses pointed toward search lines disappearing between the pines. For a week or two, the Mercer boys' faces were on every evening broadcast in the region. Then, as the days dragged on and there were no arrests, no discoveries, and no clear theory, coverage moved from the top of the hour to the middle of the show, and finally to short updates read over B-roll of the lake at sunset. Within the department, the language around the case shifted too. At first, reports referred to an active rescue effort. As time passed with no sign of struggle and no remains, the wording changed to ongoing missing persons investigation. Without a body, without a confession, there was no way to declare a homicide. Without credible sightings leaving the park, it was hard to fully believe in a clean stranger abduction. Every possibility seemed to collapse under lack of evidence. By the late 1990s, the command post was long gone. The yellow tape came down. The only visible reminder at Silver Ridge Lake was the way parents watched their children more closely near the water. In the sheriff's office, what remained of the Mercer case fit into a small set of binders, witness statements, search maps with Lawson's shaded unsafe zone, and Ellison's notes, margins crowded with question marks. Officially, it was a cold case. Unofficially, Ellison kept the file within arm's reach of his desk, unwilling to shove it into deep storage with the others. The story of Evan and Jacob Mercer could have ended there, as a mystery sealed in pine and water. But years later, in a part of the forest search teams never fully touched, a single discovery would pull those binders back into the light and force everyone to reconsider what really happened at Silver Ridge Lake. By 2010, Silver Ridge Lake had gone quiet again. The command tents were long gone, the news vans had moved on, and what happened to Evan and Jacob Mercer had settled into local memory as a story you lowered your voice to tell. On paper, the case was a cold file. In reality, it was something else, a question that never really left the people who lived around that water. On a cool spring morning that year, a hobbyist named Tyler Reed parked his pickup at a small turnout near the north side of the forest. Tyler wasn't a detective, a ranger, or a reporter. He was a weekend metal detectorist with a small YouTube channel and a GoPro strapped to his chest, the kind of person who usually dug up bottle caps, old nails, and the occasional lost coin. That morning, he decided to leave the main trails behind and work a faint path that curled deeper into the trees, a stretch of land that, years earlier, had been marked on ranger maps as rough and not worth the trouble. To him, it was just another patch of ground no one else had bothered with. The footage from his camera shows the slow sweep of the detector's coil over moss and needles. For a while, it's the usual soft, unsteady tones of minimal noise. Then, suddenly, the device lets out a strong, sustained signal. The display spikes. Tyler stops. He marks the spot with his boot, then kneels and starts to dig. At first, it looks like every other find, a few inches of soil, some roots, a bit of rusted metal. But as he clears the dirt away, a shape emerges, a small, corroded metal box, wedged hard into the earth. On the video, you can hear him laugh under his breath. Old lunch tin, maybe. He brushes off the lid. There are no markings, no name. The latch is stiff, but it gives. The camera tilts slightly as he opens it, and that's when the tone of his voice changes. Inside, wrapped in what used to be plastic, are children's items, a toy car, a faded baseball cap, and beneath them, paper that has survived only because it was sealed from the weather. Tyler doesn't dig further. He closes the box, steps back, and does the one thing that sets this moment apart from 100 other relic finds. He calls law enforcement. When Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison arrives at the scene, he's older than he was in 1995. He carries more years on the job, more closed cases, more compromises. But the Mercer file is one he has never been able to file away in his mind. As soon as he hears kids' belongings, metal box, north side of the lake, he understands that whatever is in that soil could change everything. The discovery site is taped off and photographed. Forensic techs work slowly, documenting the box exactly as it was found before sealing it in an evidence bag. Back at the sheriff's office, Ellison watches as each item is laid out under controlled light. The toy car is scuffed, its paint chipped in ways that line up almost too neatly with an old family photo of Evan on the cabin floor, pushing that same model across a board game. The cap is sun-faded, its logo barely visible, but Laura Mercer recognizes it almost immediately. "Evan wouldn't take that thing off," she says, voice low. Then there are the papers. A bus ticket stub, stamped 2003, from a city hundreds of miles away. A blurred instant photo that appears to show two teenage boys standing at a small bus depot, one taller, one shorter, both looking away from the camera. The older boy's profile is soft, out of focus, but the jawline and posture echo what we've already seen in Evan's childhood pictures. There's also a photocopied application for seasonal work at a campground, filled out in neat block letters under a name that no one in Maple Ridge recognizes. None of it is definitive. There is no DNA, no full-face shot, no signed confession. But taken together, the items push the story past the lake. For the first time, the files on Ellison's desk show a plausible path forward in time, from a shoreline in Oregon to a bus stop in another state, to a job that would have paid cash and asked few questions. Ellison's team goes back to basics, but with new tools. They run the ticket number through the bus company's archive, reconstruct the route, and identify the cities it served that summer. They send the instant photo to analysts who compare bone structure and features against known images of Evan and Jacob. The results come back careful, consistent with, but not conclusive. It's the kind of language investigators know by heart, enough to move, not enough to close. Then they ask a different question, not just what was in the box, but where it was. When they overlay the GPS coordinates of the discovery on top of the original 1995 search maps, a pattern jumps out. The box was buried just inside a sector that had been shaded off for years by one man's pen, Ranger Eric Lawson's unsafe terrain. A zone where, officially, ground searches weren't recommended. Ellison pulls Lawson's old maps and logs. The same shaded block appears again and again, paired with brief notes about unstable ground and old blowdowns. Yet when newer crews walk that area in 2010, they find dense trees, uneven footing, but nothing so dangerous it couldn't have been searched with care. In interviews, Lawson repeats the same line. The terrain wasn't worth the risk. Resources were better used elsewhere. He says it calmly, evenly, but Ellison hears what's missing, any explanation for why that particular patch of forest, so close to the picnic site, remained a blind spot for so long. For the Mercer family, the discovery cuts both ways. On one hand, a bus ticket and a grainy photograph hint at survival, that at least one boy, maybe both, made it out of Silver Ridge Lake alive. On the other hand, the same evidence raises a harder possibility that their sons left without ever looking back, helped by someone who knew exactly how to use the forest and its search patterns to cover their tracks. By the time this chapter closes, the Mercer case has shifted. It is no longer framed solely as an unsolved disappearance pinned to a single summer afternoon. It now stretches into the early 2000s, into bus stations and seasonal jobs, into a gray space between victimhood and choice. The question for investigators, and for the family, is no longer just what happened at the lake. It's who helped two boys vanish, and why did they stay gone? Those are the questions that will drive what happens next, as the investigation turns inward, toward institutions, decisions, and the people who controlled where searchers were allowed to walk. By the time the metal box from the woods was logged, photographed, and filed, the Mercer case had already outlived most investigations of its kind. 15 years after Evan and Jacob vanished from a summer picnic, Silver Ridge Lake was once again a quiet Oregon landmark. But inside the Maple Ridge Sheriff's Office, that discovery forced the department to rewrite how it described what happened there. On paper, the change was technical but profound. The boys' file, once framed as a missing persons case with suspected foul play at the lake, was updated to reflect a different working theory, a probable voluntary disappearance, facilitated by an unknown adult, with indications that at least one child survived into adolescence. It was hedged in careful language and qualifiers, but it acknowledged what the bus ticket, the photograph, and the work application suggested, that the story did not end on the shoreline in 1995. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison pushed that reclassification forward, knowing it would trigger more than paperwork. The new theory brought scrutiny not only to the original search, but to the people who controlled where that search went. Chief among them was Ranger Eric Lawson. Internal reviewers pulled Lawson's maps, logs, and memos from storage. On a conference table downtown, years of field notes were laid out side by side. The pattern was impossible to miss, the same northern block of forest shaded, labeled unsafe terrain, and repeatedly left for last, or left out entirely, during search planning. When newer teams walked that same ground after the 2010 discovery, they found dense trees, uneven roots, but nothing close to the catastrophic hazards those notes implied. Lawson was interviewed repeatedly. He explained his choices as conservative risk management, rooted in old guidance about blowdowns and unstable soil. He denied ever seeing the metal box or knowing anything about the boys beyond what everyone else knew. Without direct evidence tying him to the placement of those items, or to any face in the blurred photograph, investigators couldn't push the case into criminal territory. In the end, Lawson faced disciplinary action for how he documented and managed the search area, and left his position under a cloud, but not in handcuffs. Ellison's team, meanwhile, chased the paper trail that box had opened. The seasonal work application led them to a campground several states away, a place that cycled through short-term staff every summer. Old employment logs, faded and incomplete, hinted at two teenage boys who worked odd jobs there in 2004 under first names that didn't match any in the Mercer file. A former manager remembered two kids who kept to themselves, but couldn't say for sure who they were. The bus ticket stub sent investigators to a transportation archive. They reconstructed the route from the early 2000s, pulled what little camera footage survived from those stations, and froze frames where two boys might match the ages Evan and Jacob would have been. Analysts drew circles and lines on stills, comparing jawlines and builds, but each conclusion stopped at the same phrase, consistent with, not conclusive. For Ryan and Laura, those findings were less about evidence and more about how to live. Ryan leaned toward the idea that their sons had walked away from the lake with help, that somewhere along the line, someone offered them an exit, and they took it. If there's a chance they made it, I have to hold on to that, he told a counselor years later. For him, believing in survival, even an unexplained one, was a way to breathe. Laura struggled with that same thought. The notion that Evan and Jacob might have been alive for years, maybe still alive now, but never called, never wrote, sat heavy. It was easier, in some ways, to imagine a single terrible moment at the lake than a long, silent decision to stay gone. Her work with families of other missing children gave her language for that tension. Hope is comfort, and hope is a wound that never closes. In Maple Ridge, the Mercer case settled into something between cautionary tale and civic memory. Part of the picnic ground near Silver Ridge Lake was turned into a small memorial, a plaque with the boys' names, a pair of benches facing the water. Parents still told their kids not to wander out of sight near the tree line. New rangers were trained on revised protocols. No single person could unilaterally block off large search zones again. Not long after the internal review concluded, Ellison retired. On his last day, he boxed up his desk and left most files for the next detective. The Mercer binders were different. He carried them to the records room himself, slid them onto a shelf marked open/inactive, and added a final note summarizing the voluntary disappearance theory and the unresolved role of whoever helped shape it. He didn't write the boys' names in that note. He didn't need to. The story ends where many cold cases do, with a set of possibilities instead of an answer. Maybe Evan and Jacob were led out of the woods by someone who knew how to use gaps in protocols and blind spots in maps. Maybe they built lives far from Maple Ridge under names no one here would recognize. Or maybe the truth sits somewhere in between, a blend of choice, fear, and circumstances we'll never fully see. The last image is simple, a thin stack of binders on a metal shelf, their labels fading, and outside, a lake that looks the same as it did in 1995, still, reflective, giving nothing back. As you think about this case, we'd like to hear from you. What do you believe happened after that day at Silver Ridge Lake? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments, and, if you'd like to follow more stories like this, consider subscribing so these questions, and these families, aren't left entirely in the dark.